Welcome, everyone. My name is David Waxberg. I'm among the many leaders of Indivisible Palo Alto Plus. On behalf of IPA Plus, welcome to the third Democracy Forum. Who's watching? Safeguarding our privacy. Democracy Forum aims to provide a deep dive educational experience that will equip all of us with the knowledge, skills, and tools we need to preserve and strengthen the American democratic experiment. And it is in dire need of strengthening. These forums are applied education because Indivisible is an action-oriented group. We seek to learn about issues related to democracy and learn what we can do about them. Hence, our title includes a verb. We will cover not only who's watching us and the implications of surveillance, but also how we can safeguard our privacy and our democracy. So strap in, because it might get bumpy. We have a few elected officials with us. I'm not going to be able to name them all, but I want to at least acknowledge we've got folks from Palo Alto City Council, East Palo Alto City Council, Foster City and Cupertino City Councils, and candidates for the City Council for Palo Alto and Mountain View. Thank you all for being with us. Our panel will be moderated by Cyrus Farivar. Cyrus is an award-winning technology journalist, author, communication strategist based in Oakland. He currently runs Farivar Media, teaches journalism at UC Berkeley, served as senior writer at Forbes. He's authored 2 books, The Internet of Elsewhere and Habeas Data. And Cyrus, the floor is yours.
Thank you to David and the team that put on this event. My name is Cyrus Farivar. It's a delight to be here with you, to spend a Sunday afternoon with all of you. It's not every day, as I know many of our guests here can attest, that you have so many beautiful people such as yourself here to talk about one of the most important issues facing all of our communities. So thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us. I wanted to very, very briefly introduce our panel. I have known these incredibly smart, incredibly hardworking people for some years now. To my immediate left is Reem Suleiman, the Senior Campaigns Director for Fight for the Future. Reem formerly served on the Oakland Privacy Commission, which I hope we'll get into a little bit later in the discussion. To Reem's left is Brian Hofer, the Executive Director of Secure Justice, who also chaired the Oakland Privacy Commission for, 10 years, and was its founding chair. Left, I believe, last year, if I'm not mistaken. To his left is Cindy Cohn, the recently retired but yet still wants to talk about privacy, former executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a members-based organization just up the road in San Francisco. I am a longtime proud member of the EFF. I would encourage other people to join as well. Thank you all for being here with me. I would love to start out by talking a little bit about some of the surveillance that's happening currently in our communities, and specifically here in Palo Alto. Brian, I believe you shared with folks, there's a stack of flyers up at the front, a chart that I think you made showing a chart that's going up. If you haven't seen it, it's up at the front. It's charting communities that have decided to no longer do business with the Flock Corporation. And it's a chart that's going like this. And so I'd love to hear from Brian about what does that say to you when you make this chart and you add data points, when you see communities, even right here in the Bay Area, that are deciding to no longer do business with Flock.
I like how you start off with the most frustrating question of my life. We're in the upside down world where the Bay Area is the strongest defender of one of the largest, most fast expanding surveillance technology vendors in the country, Flock Safety. And you can sort of see in the very, very back, the gentleman is sort of holding up that foam board. And if you saw a stock chart like that, I'm pretty sure you'd want to invest. About a year ago, Flock expanded rather rapidly. They are certainly everywhere. There's no dispute about that. And all over the Bay Area, every single day, if you drive, you are being tracked by one of their license plate readers. And your data is being retained in their databases, which are getting commingled with even more data sets these days. And if you look at that later, and you'll notice that the dramatic increase has all been within the last calendar year, as the rest of the country, not the Bay Area, but the rest of the country is finally figuring out how dangerous and invasive these technologies are. I think this year alone, it's something like 56 contracts have been terminated or not awarded in the first place. And so we've been trying to spend a lot of time and resources in the next coming months trying to stop this here in the Bay Area. San Jose has 500 cameras. Oakland has 294. San Francisco has 400. I mean, it's everywhere, and you are being tracked with these things.
Reem, I'd love to hear from you about Flock specifically and how Flock and other technologies fit into some of the communities who you are constantly advocating for.
The Oakland Flock fight, as many others were. And it was incredible to see actually how many people turned up. There were people in the hundreds that came to the contract, and it was such a huge blow to, to our democracy to see, the city council there shut it down. And I just want to comment, I will answer the second part of your question, about how powerful fear has been, in terms of like the media narrative, to local lawmakers. And I think it hit me when I was like being interviewed about the Flock vote in Oakland. There's no members of the press here besides you. Anyway, I don't care. I'll say it. I was being interviewed by like the CBS reporter, and I was talking about how Flock has ties to ICE immigration raids. It's been used to prosecute and investigate out-of-state abortions. And while I was speaking on this interview, the B-roll was like machine guns firing in Oakland. And like it was a very intentional choice. And it really reminded me so much about the childhood that I had growing up as a Muslim in a post 9/11 environment where, the war on terror was meant to conjure up fear. And I think back then, the response from the community, and it's understandable when, you're seeing people in the community being sent to Guantanamo or having their charitable, contributions looked at with a microscope. The instinct is to shrink yourself and to be defensive and not respond, right, with the full force that we're seeing now, right? And I think there is so much to say about how Indivisible has shown up in this moment with courage, which is the antidote. It's absolutely the antidote. And I think when it comes to surveillance, we need to show that courage in the face of the fear that we hear in the media. And when we see things like that, we need to call it out. We need that counter narrative to be front and center. But the question was about, just all of the other surveillance fights that we have. Because like after Oakland, for me, I was like, okay, I need to pivot strategically, and what else can we win? And that's part of the reason why we decided at Fight for the Future to focus on the corporate sector. Because, think of how many Lowe's or Home Depots exist across the country. If we can put enough pressure to have one of them fold, that's thousands of parking lots that will have their cameras stripped. And so I think that's something that we've thought is a good opportunity. And just speaking locally, one thing that we've been focusing on is facial recognition. There was a report of several gay bars in the Castro that are using TSA-style facial recognition for entry to get in. And, Pride weekend is now, and Brian was just telling me about a huge police response from SFPD following the trans visibility march. And so these are really, really dangerous things where, I think there's lots of places where we can turn our attention. But I want, if I can underline anything, it's that, the surveillance fight does not begin and end with, your city Flock contract. There's so many targets, there's so many opportunities to try and keep us as a community safer.
And Cindy, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who's been involved in this advocacy, legal, I've seen you in courtrooms many times. You have been in this fight maybe longer than anyone in this room, I'm not sure, but certainly on this stage, I'll say for that with certainty. I'd love for you to set, right, we've been talking a little bit about, we've been picking on the flock safety specifically. I'd love for you to give us a broader perspective as to how flock is or is not different than what came before. Is it more pernicious? Is it more pervasive? Is it worse? Is it, how do you see it as fitting into the kind of the longer arc of the surveillance struggle that you've been part of?
Right after 9/11, there was a big shift in this country where we seem to have lost our ability to say no. First to the national security authorities, and then to state, local law enforcement across the board, which is kind of ahistorical if you think about it. You know, the US Constitution, if you look at the Bill of Rights, it's a whole set of things saying no to what government can do. The Fourth Amendment is what, kind of classically has limits on what law enforcement could do from what it might otherwise want to do. But we lost that. And I think that this drift from the start, where the arguments were around national security and the entities doing a lot of the surveillance were really national security focused, first with the NSA and then with the FBI. What we've seen is the technology and the surveillance strategy and the not saying no to law enforcement strategy is just getting closer and closer to people's homes, where now we've got Flock, we've got Ring, we've got facial recognition stuff that is really literally in our backyards in a way that just, as a technical matter, wasn't as possible in 9/11. The other piece of this that I think is important to lay on the table is that after 9/11, the government was very good at collecting information, and companies were pretty good at collecting information. They weren't as good about using it. And now, along with the kind of ability to put flock cameras everywhere and network them and talk to them, we've got the rise of AI, which makes it a lot easier to use all the data that they're collecting. So in some ways, we're in kind of this storm where the technologies are making some of the problems that started in 9/11 much bigger, much more powerful, and much more closer to our homes. But I think it's the same underlying impulse, which is this kind of law enforcement idea that if they could just see everything that everybody does, they could make us safer. Of course, that's never been true for marginalized people who rightfully fear the police. That's not a comforting thing. I actually don't think it's all that true for people who have power in society either. And I'm happy to talk about kind of my view of privacy, which is a little different than I think some of the things we hear in popular culture. But this idea that surveillance makes us safe is really, I think, at bottom of the whole thing, all the way from 9/11 to today.
I want to piggyback a little bit on, and I love that you used the word pernicious. It is far more invasive today than it was in the old days. And there's multiple reasons for that. Cindy said AI. We don't really do antitrust litigation in this country anymore. There's really only 4 companies, what I call verticals, that municipal governments can go to get all the different technologies that they're using right now. And every single one of those 4 vendors wants to be the one-stop shop. We'll build your real-time crime center. We'll have the license plate readers, the CCTV, the facial recognition, the software that's going to connect it all, the open source intelligence, Flock Nova. This is another piece that they're bringing out where they got caught ingesting stolen data. A whistleblower leaked that. And so the amount of power, the amount of commingled data sets allows greater inferences, greater confidence scores in identifying people. So it is far more powerful than it used to be in the old days. And what I like to do is I openly admit, I'm trying to create friction points. I'm trying to slow it down and go back to that pre-9/11 where data is siloed. And I realize that's an aggressive position. Honestly, if I was law enforcement, I would want all the data as well. I really would. But whenever we have that balancing question, it's always, Brian, you need to tone down your pro-privacy argument. It's never, maybe we've gone too far. And that's where I think the Bay Area is right now, is that we've crossed beyond the reasonable minds may disagree on where to draw that line. We're not having an honest conversation. No municipal government in the Bay Area honestly evaluates these technologies. They love the favorable fact pattern, but they never ever want to talk about the negatives that come with this.
You know, we talk about Flock. We've mentioned a few other facial technologies, facial recognition. Flock is, of course, one company that makes automated license plate readers, a technology that I think most of us are familiar with. There's all kinds of other technologies that are out there, and all of this is being done, as you alluded to a moment ago, Brian. This is being done in the name of public safety. This is being done in the name of we law enforcement, we policymakers and community leaders need this to make our communities safer. What actually happens? Like okay, so there's let's say there's a flock camera outside. What's the real world? How does that actually unfold? You know, if I'm driving a stolen car down in front of the camera, what's actually happening?
I mean, it depends on who's getting access, and I think one of the reasons why Flock has been actually such an effective target is there's so many incredible researchers that have demonstrated how easy it is, you know, for people to hack into it, how lax the company has been. I mean, we hosted an action at Flock headquarters in Atlanta recently, and around the same time, Atlanta was, there was a city outside of Atlanta that was considering renewing a Flock contract, and at that same time, you know, there's a story that broke out that the Flock executives were live streaming the footage of inside a community center at a pool where, you know, there were for hours on end, and like it was it just demonstrated, you know, most people, right, won't encounter one of these harms, but when you do, it's severe, right? And it's like, when there's an ICE immigration raid, like how we don't really even get to see all of the tech that's behind the scenes. Surveillance is, you know, very much intentionally hidden. And so it's very hard, oftentimes, as like advocates to be like, this was the problem, but they're, like Cindy was saying, they're in communication with each other. They're becoming more and more efficient at, you know, synthesizing all of the different data points that come from multiple sources in order to be able to track people in real time. And part of that is like, you know, the data broker industry is a part of that. The technical capabilities have expanded, you know, and this stuff is pervasive. Even, you know, the Ring cameras, I just want to highlight that because it's on nearly every doorstep. And so this is one thing that we developed, actually, these little door hangers that you can download if you'd like on flockout.org, where you can essentially start a conversation with your neighbors in a very gentle way to educate them about how Ring, even though Ring has announced that they've dropped their Flock contract, they still have a contract with Axon, and Axon also has ties to Customs and Border Patrol. And in general, you know, the more surveillance that's around, I've heard it compared to recycling in a way, like you just don't want to keep that stuff, and the cumulative effect is more and more dangerous with the time, you know, the more you have it on hand. And so I think in terms of risk, we're seeing, like with facial recognition technology, we're live streaming ICE agents in Minnesota being able to snap a photo of somebody, a protester, and be able to run it through their mobile facial recognition app and be able to call that protester by name and you know, track them and know where they live and all of these things. And so I think it's become really clear to people the harm, which is why that Super Bowl moment was so amazing to me. I'm like admittedly the person who's only there for the halftime show, but I heard that there was a commercial about what was the pet thing?
Puppy.
The lost puppy feature. Yeah, it was essentially facial recognition to help identify and locate lost puppies, and the internet blew up. I mean, this is it's a huge pop culture moment where there are millions of people watching this, and the outrage was so big, and people were immediately able to recognize how creepy and invasive this was, that almost immediately Ring had announced that they dropped Flock. Like, I think that's actually, to me, such a strong indication of how much collective power we have and how much people are starting to understand the connections between these things.
Do we, and I'll ask this to Cindy as well, do you feel like you, as an advocate, as a professional, somebody who knows people, you've been in forums like this, I'm sure, a gazillion times previously, do you feel like regular people have a good sense of how these technologies are being used in their names for their own benefit, ostensibly?
I mean, I would say that today more people know and realize it than ever before. I would also just point out that I appreciate the plug for EFF, but I am also a proud member of Fight for the Future, which is also a membership organization. So we're not the only ones. And I still say we, because I've only been gone a week and it's going to take a while. But I think that we wouldn't have filled this beautiful church a few years ago about license plate readers, and street level, what we call street level surveillance at EFF. So I think more people know. I think one of the things that we have to combat, and this is why I was excited to come talk to this Indivisible crowd, is this feeling of hopelessness, this feeling of that I know about this, but there's nothing I can do about it. Or the kind of more entitled version of that, which is I've done nothing wrong, so I have nothing to fear. I think right now in this time of immigration raids, of reproductive justice, a mother and her daughter, mother was prosecuted for having a Facebook conversation with her daughter about an abortion, right? Those stories are permeating in a way that are making more and more people feel that the stakes are actually much higher than they thought they were, because the people in power who now control these surveillance techniques are less and less accountable to the people who they're governing, and more interested in, oppressing minority groups. So that moment that we're in now, and it's more than a moment, and hopefully, God forbid, a couple more years of a government that's willing to use all of this surveillance against disfavored people, and the fact that who's disfavored is changing so fast that I don't think anybody could really have an honest conversation with themselves and think it would never be me. That's bringing more people into the conversation than I ever remember. And remember, it doesn't take that many people to actually make change. It doesn't take, what's that old line about a few well-committed people are the ones who've changed the world? I think that's actually true. And I think that, by joining Indivisible and showing up here and being part of that, you're helping to make your voice heard, that we can and we will fight back.
Brian, you've been as the longtime chair of the Oakland Privacy Commission, and for those who don't know, the Oakland Privacy Commission is an entity that I really admire, both just as an Oakland resident, but just as a regular, citizen. The Oakland Privacy Commission is fairly unique, I think, still in the Bay Area and in California and the nation, as being a city-level institution that Reem also served on for a long time, where city entities, and you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, city entities have to go proactively before the commission and present an affirmative case as to why they need to acquire a given technology for whatever reason. Often, very often, it's law enforcement, but sometimes it's like sanitation or something like that. And they're also required to come back before the commission after a year and say, hey, we bought a bunch of drones, or we bought some Flock cameras, or we did X or Y, and here was the result. And we can evaluate whether it was effective or not effective, and has to be accountable to the commissioners. I'm curious, Brian, when you've been in conversations in meetings with law enforcement, and Oakland, I've lived in Oakland a long time. I think both of you live in Oakland. Oakland, there is actual crime that actually happens in Oakland. What are the arguments that you hear from the police chief, from the brass, that say, we need, whether it's Flock or anything else, right? We need that to bring crime down in Oakland. What do they tell you?
Great question. And just to give some background information. I helped lead the effort to create the first municipal privacy commission in the world, to my knowledge, certainly in the country, and that was March of 2016 was our first meeting. I later, a few years later, helped San Diego stand up the second, and that's all we've really got is 2. Both of those commissions are nested within a surveillance technology vetting framework that the ACLU created a model for. If you've heard the acronym CCOPS, Community Control Over Policing Surveillance, there's little different flavors of it around the country now, but there's approximately 30 entities in the country that said, you know what, instead of putting technology out into the wild and then worrying about the problems later, let's turn that on its head, do an analysis up front, like you would do in your own personal life before even making just a regular investment, or certainly before you do something potentially controversial or dangerous, you'd want to evaluate the pros and the cons. And that is the standard in the surveillance ordinance, both upfront and later when the annual report comes back with the data, that the benefits of using that technology have to outweigh the costs. The cost is, the focus is certainly to protecting our civil liberties, but there is a taxpayer component. Some of this technology from a privacy perspective is benign. It also doesn't work. And we're spending millions of taxpayer dollars on it, on strategies that are just demonstrably ineffective. Before I answer the meat of your question, as a longtime Oaklander, I'm gonna ask you, does your police department respond to stolen vehicle alerts that they get from Flock?
In Oakland?
Yeah.
I'm going to guess no.
No. The number one selling point for license plate readers in the old days, which they've been around since the late 70s, was to overcome the hiding in plain sight phenomenon, to locate stolen vehicles. And in Oakland, we don't even bother to respond to those. So the messaging is always, suspicious, when they're coming to the commission. I always ask and get deep in. In Oakland, we're obviously very sensitive to gun violence. I am not the type of activist to pretend there was not a crime spike during the pandemic. There was. But if you were paying attention in 2018 and 2019, nationwide, and certainly here in the Bay Area, we were at generational lows. And if you're paying attention today, you'll notice that we're going back to that generational low baseline. Now, the pro-mass surveillance folks are gonna say, yeah, Brian, it's because you put Flock everywhere. Well, here's what you might not know in Oakland after that big December 16 vote that we're presently litigating for the second time I'm suing my city. Oakland never actually acquired the Flock technology they said they were gonna go get. They never got the CCTV, they never got the extra software, they never got the extra drones. They're still using the license plate readers, but causation is always flimsy when we get here. Do I think license plate readers have ever had legitimate successes? Yes. Has CCTV footage ever been used to successfully prosecute violent criminals at trial? Yes. But as I mentioned earlier, that balancing question, when we really get into the data, anybody know, just shout it out, what is the historical hit rate for license plate readers? Amen. 0.1%. That's just an alert. That isn't successful resolution. That just means I got some alert that tells me I need to go pay attention to something. 0.1%. Do you know how many plate scans your police department collected this last year?
This last year, I'm going to guess hundreds of thousands, millions.
600 million with 292 cameras. So you think about San Jose with 500, you think about San Francisco with 400. We are collecting billions of data points, maybe as a nation, on a monthly, at least a quarterly basis. And 0.1% of them have nominal public safety value. And then out of that, it's an even smaller fraction where we actually solve the case. And so that's the balancing conversation. When I criticize people for being unwilling to fairly evaluate, I have never walked into any meeting and said, this technology has never worked ever. That's a stupid position to take. But it's also stupid to say that it is an absolute lifesaver and without it, we're gonna all die of murder.
Yeah. Well, and you yourself, I don't know how many people know this story, but Brian was himself pulled over by a law enforcement official. I believe you were in Contra Costa County. You were pulled over. You had a Turo rental car, and an alert went off by a sheriff's deputy. And did they hold you at gunpoint? Tell us the story.
Yeah, well, first off, let's talk about the efficacy of the technology. So my baby brother and I were driving up home for Thanksgiving weekend, November 2018, from Oakland up to the real Northern California. And so we drove up 80, which is the entire highway corridor has fixed license plate readers all over. No alerts. So that's one other thing you need to understand. It often misreads and doesn't scan accurately. That's another problem that we're not going to get into. On the return trip, I noticed a sheriff's deputy tailing us. It's rush hour traffic. I'm obviously not speeding or doing any reckless driving. Flashes his lights, pulls us over. It's evening. I intentionally pull under a bright light because I got no idea what's going on. Don't ask us any questions. Don't say a word. 4 officers pull guns out, point them at us. They make us exit one out at a time, do a backwards perp walk, put us in handcuffs, throw us in separate squad cars, illegally search the trunk, the bags, the entire vehicle. I'm sitting in the back of this police car looking at the monitor, and I see Vigilant Solutions, which used to be the dominant license plate reader manufacturer before Flock took over. And I see it says stolen vehicle alert. I don't immediately connect the dots, but it's right there on the screen in front of me. And then the officers come over, finally ask for our ID, and finally start to ask what's going on. And it was the scanner worked. It found the license plate it was looking for. It was a hot list error. Totally another problem that we are not going to talk about. That license plate never should have been on a hot list. But it indicated that I was a violent criminal. I had guns pulled on me. They actually threw my baby brother on the ground, and we did sue them. After the New York Times picked that up, I had more than 100 people reach out to me to share similar stories, and most of them involved guns. We don't even have enough time to talk about the reliance on these automated systems that are going faster and faster, and the data hygiene errors that are happening have real life-threatening consequences. There is public safety harm that is possibly occurring from the use of these technologies.
I'm getting a lot of questions on the Slido app, and I would encourage people, if you're comfortable, to share questions that way. You can also upvote them if you want to. I'm curious, Cindy, well, for all of you, really. We've talked about a lot of the problems that currently exist. We've talked about mishaps that fortunately didn't get worse. We have some policymakers here in the room. We have some people that are running for office here in the room. We have a whole room full of concerned citizens that would like to maybe advocate for alternatives, right? They don't want X, they want Y, but maybe they don't know what Y is, right? What should they ask for? What should policymakers, right? If we think that Flock isn't, acting appropriately, or Vigilant Solutions or whatever other company, is there a better solution? I'm looking right at Cindy because I
don't think mass surveillance is the solution to societal problems. So I'd like my tax dollars back. I think that depending on the particular problem you're trying to solve, it's interesting to me because your hypo was about a stolen car driving by, right? And Brian just told us, they're not even investigating those, right? So the stories that we're being told about how this stuff is successful, often if you scratch them, it's not really all that true. And I'm with Brian. I would never say zero, but if we get rid of free speech in this country, would we stop a lot of harm? Probably. We don't have rights because the other side, we have rights because it's too powerful to give people in power control over our speech and over our privacy, not because there aren't harms that are real. And so, maybe I could have those tax dollars back, or maybe they could go to support other ways. Law enforcement has plenty of tools already in their thing. And to me, a lot of this mass surveillance is the solution that nobody asked for. Right? Quite often when we go to communities, we find that this stuff is Oakland is is an exception. Many times we find this stuff has been deployed and the local mayor, the local government don't even know, because we have so insulated law enforcement, both federal and state, from local control. That's why the CCOP's name, community control, is the thing we need to regain. So I guess it's not, there isn't another technical solution to this problem. The solutions are societal, and technology, mass surveillance is not, I don't think it's the right answer as a legal matter, as a constitutional lawyer matter, which is where, that's my education and background. But I actually don't think as a societal matter, mass surveillance is the answer to any of the problems that it's being proposed to answer. And the other piece that we've talked a little about, but I want to talk a little bit more about, is about who the mass surveillance is aimed at in our society, is really important in terms of thinking about the downsides of it, right? Again, a perfectly benevolent, always right, never wrong kind of officer-friendly version of the cops doesn't exist for many, many people in our society right now. So we shouldn't build systems that presume that the people in charge of it are always going to be right and just and upthinking. Our government in the United States was based on the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. There's a very famous quote from a founder that, if men were governed by angels, we wouldn't need any government. Our whole governmental structure needs to be robust to the fact that the people in charge might not be always acting in the best interest of the people, and mass surveillance is not consistent with that.
I just wanted to add on to that, because I think ultimately all of the debates boil down to whether mass surveillance is a public safety solution. And I remember this debate, coming out where there were pro-Flock folks that were, interacting with some of our coalition members. And somebody made an excellent point that surveillance is a documentation tool, and so the funny thing is, just remembering how these vendors often sell it to us and sold us when we were on the Privacy Commission, we were often told this was a preventative measure, but by definition, surveillance is often very much invisible, and so it doesn't even have that preventative effect. And I think you can't have a conversation about public safety and think that just documenting that is enough. And I think of the locks at CVS all the time, actually, when I am having these debates, because rather than fixating on the cameras and the locks, on the baby formula and the feminine products, why aren't we interrogating why people need to have locks on baby formula and feminine products? The fact that people cannot access basic necessities should be the bigger alarm. That is actually how you increase public safety, is by getting into the issues of affordability that underline why these stores have to lock it up. And I think there's utility for sure. I will not argue that you can find utility for some of these technologies, but it is incredibly, incredibly misleading and just wrong to sell this as a public safety solution when we know for a fact it creates a public safety harm for so many people. And we have no idea how administrations will repurpose this. We're seeing this firsthand. Part of the environment that we exist in the United States without having strong privacy protections, a data broker industry that is running completely wild and free, all of these things are the context which make surveillance actually incredibly dangerous for people. So I think we need to be unabashed in refuting some of those claims and really get to the root of the societal issue, which is not that a bigger camera is going to make things better. If that were the logic, we have invested how much technology that's only gotten more and more advanced, and do any of us feel more safe because of it? So I think having these conversations within our communities, with our local council members, but also with the media, because I think especially local media loves to perpetuate and use this fear-mongering to keep us in this cycle of renewing very expensive contracts that could go towards, public benefit, actually having some sort of public benefits infrastructure for us in the US, which would go miles more to actually preventing crime than any camera could.
I've worked with more than 100 municipalities in my 12 years, and almost every single one on paper has some form of community policing. A lot of them don't fund it, don't take it seriously. They have community resource officers. And as all these new emerging technologies are coming out, we've gotten away from like the human relationships, the knowing your community. Oakland has had community policing for 25 years on paper. It's almost never been funded. And most of our police do not live in our city. They have no relationship to the community. Every honest police officer will tell you that their greatest successes come from witnesses, from informants, from people that can confide in them. And where am I going with this? Well, I've said this 1,000 times, certainly in Oakland at the Privacy Commission and elsewhere, that if we actually had real accountability in this country for law enforcement misconduct, I probably would trust you with more powerful technologies. I'm so aggressive right now is because when you do something wrong, there's nothing I can do but sue the city, and the taxpayers pay our attorney's fees. The individual officers rarely, almost statistically at zero, suffer the consequences of their own misconduct. And that's really, I think, what's missing, is that if we can start actually holding people accountable. California took forever to finally get a decertification statute on the books. A number of other, California is not always so progressive at the state level. There is a lot of states that were far ahead of us in that regard. There are certainly other alternate strategies that do not rely on having the most advanced, most powerful AI-enabled technologies. And we're just afraid, I think, there's, with the political climate in this country, there's some political risk in having the courage to take those positions. And so I hope, like chapters, like the Invisible Palo Alto Plus, that you encourage, if you do find a champion on the city council, on your county board, that you encourage and support and campaign for those elected officials that are willing to stick their neck out and say, let's go down a different road, because they do need support.
There have been a couple of questions surrounding the legality of a lot of these tools. And I think a few members of our audience are maybe in the same place that I was some years ago when I first started falling down this license plate and other surveillance technology rabbit hole, which is, why is this even allowed in the first place? What does the Constitution say or not say about the legality of these technologies to begin with?
Well, there's a case coming out from the U.S. Supreme Court probably in the next couple of weeks that's going to answer a piece of this, right? So the kind of traditional view is that if you're out in public and other people can see you, you don't have a privacy interest that the Constitution will protect. And so license plate readers are out in public, or they're on private land, but the private landowner is controlling them. So this is your Costco's and other things, or your Ring doorbells. And the argument is that in broad measure, you just don't have privacy protections when you're out in public. There are exceptions that the Supreme Court has been willing to recognize. Location tracking over a long period of time is a decision that we got a few years ago from the Supreme Court, but we're still sorting out how long a period of time and how much is too much. The court didn't come down with a bright rule about that. So that's kind of the basic position. I think that's wrong, and it's wrong-headed. I think that when you equate secrecy with privacy, you're undermining a lot of what privacy is about, and I think actually undermining why it's in the Constitution to begin with. But I got to get 5 Supreme Court justices on my side before that will be the law of the land. But we at EFF and a lot of other organizations across the team continue to try to look for opportunities to strategically push that. We we have an interesting Supreme Court now where they are terrible on a lot of issues that I care about a lot. Sometimes the surveillance issues hit differently, like they did in the case about location tracking over time. But I'm not too optimistic now. I think we need some changes in institutional reform in the judiciary as well to get the Constitution and the statutes interpreted in ways that recognize, now that we have the ability to use digital tools to track us wherever we are, this kind of rough distinction between when you're in public and when you're in private doesn't make a lot of sense for people in terms of having privacy in their everyday lives. That's not, I don't think it's consistent with the values and the way that most people want to live in this country. It's not consistent with basic freedom, including the freedom to associate, to talk to each other, to organize, to make political change, which I think is one of the fundamental reasons why privacy is important to self-government. We talk about privacy a lot and people are thinking about maybe their sexuality or maybe their personal relationships, maybe their religion. These are all really important. But I think there's one that we often overlook, which is in order to make social change in our society, for every major social change movement, there needed to be a private space for people to communicate, to associate, to organize. And without that private space, you don't have the public part of the conversation. I've seen this in my lifetime around gay rights, especially. But the historical time of the civil rights era, the right to privacy in your associations and the Supreme Court decisions protecting that don't come out of the gay rights movement. They come out of the civil rights movement, 30, 40 years before that. Because I think that privacy is important for self-government. It's why we have the private ballot. But that should only be one piece of this. So anyway, I'm not sure I've answered your question all that directly, but I do think it's important to think of privacy as a lot broader than the Supreme Court has, and this line between whether you're in public and whether you're in private, I think is just grossly out of step with how people live their lives, and the law should reflect how we live our lives, not some bright line that's easy to articulate.
I interviewed all of these people for a book that I wrote, not to promote myself too much. I wrote a book called Habeas Data that came out 8 years ago. That's about 50 years of surveillance law in America. And it digs into, and it starts with me, a dumb guy from Oakland who doesn't know very much about how the law works, asking a lot of these questions that I think many of you have, which is, how did we get here in the first place? And a thing that sticks with me still now is that we've been talking about license plate readers and Ring cameras and Flock in particular. The Supreme Court precedent comes back to a case that was decided, I believe, in the year I was born, 1982, a case called Kylo out of Minnesota. I like to say that this case basically is Breaking Bad set in Minnesota in the 70s. It's a bunch of guys making meth, and they're driving barrels of chemicals from one place to another. And the police, in order to track them, put small, they're described in the court literature as like radios or like kind of proto-tracking devices. I sort of think of them as like pre-GPS devices. This is late 1970s technology we're talking about. And the question was, as Cindy said, is there a reasonable expectation of privacy when the police are tracking somebody's movements from point A to point B? And in that case, the Supreme Court said, yes, it is okay. There is no reasonable expectation of privacy in that instance. By extension, and you could argue whether this makes sense today in 2026 or not, the Supreme Court says, and Cindy can correct me if I'm wrong, that's why we have license plate readers, is because of that, right? Because when you and I move about Palo Alto or the South Bay or anywhere that we might go, we allow, for the most part, law enforcement to use cameras, sensory devices, other kinds of things when we're traveling in the public space. I think that putting a beeper on one guy's truck to track them from one place to another in the late 1970s is a little different than a couple hundred cameras in one city. Not to mention, right, you were talking about billions of searches quarterly, right? To me, that's that's many orders of magnitude different, right? So dichotomy for me still resonates.
I think there's another one as well, which I think it might be inherent in what you're saying, but you know, that was targeted surveillance, right? That was a guy who they thought was doing meth, and they put a thing on their car. What we're talking about now is mass surveillance, right? They don't know they don't have targets. They're just surveilling everybody and figuring out second what they actually need to know. So I would argue that is actually it's not just orders of magnitude different, it's actually a whole different thing. And deserves a very different analysis. Again, there's a case called Chatri that's going to come out from the Supreme Court about basically kind of the government going to Google and asking for all the people who were in a particular location to try to figure out whether the same person was in multiple locations at the same time and they could be a suspect. That's a form of a kind of smaller level mass surveillance, but still mass surveillance. So we'll hear from the court. It did not go well at oral argument. I am not that optimistic, but it's at least a flavor of like, can we talk about mass surveillance different than targeted surveillance? Targeted surveillance, we have a framework for, right? You go to the court, you get a warrant, and the warrant is, you know, a probable cause, and all of these, we have a framework for that. We need a framework for mass, well, honestly, I don't think we should have mass surveillance at all, but we don't have even a similar idea about mass surveillance. And I think that's an important thing that's missing now that we have the technical capability to do mass surveillance on a scale that just really wasn't possible even 20 years ago, but certainly, you know, at the time the Bill of Rights was written.
I'm surprised you haven't brought it up yet, but in Cyrus's younger days, he pulled a sneaky one on the city of Oakland and submitted a public record request for their entire ALPR database. And they gave it to him, which statistically might be the only time Oakland has ever complied with the Public Record Act without litigation, which is another story. But and what was amazing, and he certainly let me search my own license plate in there, and I boom, 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 popped up a number of times, but he showed former city council member Dan Kalb, drew a little circle on the map and says, "Do you live here?" That flipped Dan's vote. Dan had no idea how this technology worked and how amazing it is at being able to profile and identify and figure out your patterns and associations. The Institute for Justice lost a big class action in Norfolk, Virginia. The judge ignored two of the most important cases, and thankfully that case is up on appeal. But the reason I'm referencing this, the four named class defendants, the lowest number of plate scans for one of the drivers, if my memory is, I'm going to be off by one or two, but was 415 plate scans. That's the least amount. To the US Constitution, powers not expressly enumerated for the government are reserved for
the states.
How many of us have ever consented to the government tracking us as we move about our daily lives, indiscriminately collecting data, putting us in police criminal databases? We've never had that conversation. We've never had that conversation. And we could debate, you know, implied consent. You're saying we allow it. I agree that we're not doing a great enough job opposing that, but we have never ever expressly allowed to this behavior. And the invasiveness is far beyond what the founding fathers and anybody else could have contemplated. So I am hopeful that the courts someday, you know, with great lawyers and these class actions, that law is going to catch up.
Yeah, I heard everybody gasp about this, but you know, it's one of those things that's obvious once you think about it and not obvious in the moment, because you think you're just driving around and a license plate is getting you. But you know, if you know where somebody spends their nights and you know where they spends their day, you know who they are, right? You need 2, if possible, maybe 3 data points about a person to be able to identify them. So this idea that it's anonymous is complete and utter. It's not technically even close to right, let's just say.
This story about filing the records request with Oakland, it was actually shockingly easy to do, not just to file the records request, but you mentioned Dan Kalb. I reached out to all the members, sitting members at the time of the Oakland City Council. Only Mr. Kalb, representing District 1 in North Oakland, responded. the way that I knew what his license plate number was because at that time, and maybe still now, there are street parking spaces in front of the Oakland City Hall that have a sign that say reserved for District 1 City Council member, reserved for District 2, and so forth. So I literally walked up, I saw there was a car there, he's District 1, I presume that's his car. I punched it into my records that the city had sent me, and I went into his office and searched it, and as Brian said, you know, there was 10 or 12 hits on one particular block in North Oakland. I don't know exactly where he lives, but based on that, I had a pretty good idea. So it was pretty startling, I think, when we see that before our own eyes. I wanted to turn more to Reem for just a few last thoughts. You are obviously a great advocate for many of the issues that we've talked about here, served on the Oakland Privacy Commission, as we talked about. I'm curious as to when you talk to police or to lawmakers, what is it that you know, I don't think anybody comes into the job of being a city council member or a county board of supervisors saying, I'm really going to be, you know, aggressive on all of these things. Maybe not, I hope not. But I think they all, you know, in their own minds, think that they're doing the right thing when they're signing these contracts, when they're promoting deals with Flock or whatever. When you are face to face in a room with these people, how do you get them to change their thinking a little bit? What has been effective for you as an advocate?
I feel like it's a great question for Brian because I typically am making more noise on the outside and like trying to get the community pressure. But I do think, you know, sometimes even if they agree with us, you know, oftentimes, like I would say, the business community has come really, really hard in support of some of these things, and it's really hard, you know, where people feel this pressure to respond to like crime or public safety, and this gives something very concrete to say, I did this, and oftentimes, like it reminds me a little bit of like all of the cameras that I encounter going into Piedmont a little bit, where, you know, you can put this moat with an alligator around you, but ultimately, you know, there is an aspect of shared destiny here where, you know, you can fortress yourself as much as you want, but you're only as safe as the most vulnerable in your community. And like, that's something I think people really need to contend with. But I do want to get to Brian.
I don't think it's nefarious to want to solve violent crime or for private parties that are also putting cameras on their buildings and might want to connect to the police. Like, you know, they're trying to protect the value of their assets. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. What I ask for is just consider all the data. After the Dobbs ruling, I also try to find, you know, what's going to speak to that particular elected official. After the Dobbs ruling, most of the female elected officials I work with suddenly started caring about license plate reader tracking. Why? EFF, 404 Media, a lot of people have reported from public records, hey, they're actually using this technology to go look for folks that are seeking reproductive care where it hasn't been criminalized. I think you guys also published recently the No Kings protests. They're querying for folks at these protests. They're doing it. So we see evidence of harm, and that part of that conversation is just not happening. So that's been the strategy that I try to use, is that I get that these technologies can be helpful. I don't have a problem with targeted surveillance, but if we're going to talk about indiscriminate surveillance, then you need to have a full, honest evaluation of the pros and cons of using this, because it's not innocent, it's not innocuous. There are real harms happening.
I think those are all true. I think pointing out to the harms and the fact that the harms keep moving, the people who are harmed keeps moving, has helps a lot. You know, I think that too often people are in their own personal experience, and it's hard for them to think about other people. But I think that the ICE raids have made a lot of people realize that when they're sweeping up your neighbors or your family members or your loved ones, that the time has come to stop giving the benefit of the doubt to the people who are in charge of the surveillance. And I really want to take advantage of this moment where there's an increasing unease with the way the people in power are exercising their power right now, to try to point to ways that we could rebalance the scales a little bit. But it's hard, and I think surveillance is, kind of, as you mentioned, by definition, it's kind of sneaky, right? You can see a lot of things that are happening in our society, and it's easy to point at those. And surveillance is one of the things that it's harder to talk about. It's harder to connect the dots between the surveillance and, the people being swept up in an ICE raid. We have, testimony from an ICE agent in Oregon about using a tool from Palantir to try to target where their raids are. But we still don't even know all the pieces of data that went into that targeting. Given that it was location specific, I think there's a good chance that license plate readers were involved, but we don't know. So I think continuing to push for more transparency, so that we can tell the stories that we need to tell to convince people that this is worthy of their time.
I just want to say thank you again for all of you for being here. Thank you to Reem, thank you to Brian, thank you to Cindy, thank you to David, and all of the people that made this event happen. And I'll turn it back over to you.
We're gonna hear a little bit from Reem, from Brian, from Cindy, and from Cara. Reem, you want to start? Thank you. You look like you were guys going gangbusters in there.
Yeah, it was amazing actually to see how many people have literally done this in real time with their own city council or, at their workplaces and whatnot. And so I think one thing that became very clear to me in the breakout rooms is I was in the group with lots of folks from Palo Alto who were talking about all of the choke points and the pressure points here with the university and with, Palantir offices and just the tech industry at large. But ultimately, one of the takeaways that I think came up in both of the subgroups in our breakout was that we need to do the hard work of actually meeting people where they're at and having these conversations. And I think, Indivisible is actually very well positioned to do some of this education and door knocking and actually having these conversations. And, you can tell us like what is actually effective. There is a different narrative that maybe needs to be told to people who are concerned about property crime and they own homes and this and that, and they're and we need a very tailored narrative to help them understand that this is not a long-term public safety solution, even if it makes them feel safer. And then there's a whole other thing about reaching out to the students or maybe Gen Z that have a completely, they are not concerned about home owning anytime soon because the economy is very rigged towards them, but they are concerned maybe about other things. And so really having those conversations, learning from them, and I think it's something that can be a superpower for lots of us who are working on, fighting back against mass surveillance.
I really appreciate the chance to get to talk to people, and a lot of times when I'm talking to people, I'm trying to convince them to get involved and to stand up in their communities and do things. And it's such a joy and a pleasure to be in front of a bunch of people who are already got that message, right? Who are already doing it. They spent your Sunday afternoon with us here. And so I guess the things that I would have you take away with is just make sure that you're talking to your friends, make sure you're talking to other people, bringing more people in, making people feel empowered that there are things that we can do. I mean, we didn't get into this problem overnight or just because of one issue. And so we're going to have to push on all different directions and see which ones start to give to get us out of this. But I've been doing this this work for a long time, but I also lived through the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I think many people in this room, because I see the silver hair, did as well. And one of the things that I learned from that moment was that nobody predicted it. Right? There was just activism and pressure, and it felt like nothing was working, and it felt like there was a checkmate strategy for every check strategy that we had. And then one day, it just all happened. Now, it may not be as fast as that, but to me, the lesson is that if you think that you can figure out your 4-point plan and that makes everything work when you're up against the kind of power that we're up against, I think you're you're misunderstanding how change happens, this kind of big societal change. So the good news is we don't have to all rally around one big strategy, because we just keep watching each other and try the different things that work and figure out what works and then double down on it. And so that would be my thing to you, is to be patient, to resist the idea that, we have to pick one strategy and all marshal around it. That doesn't mean we don't come together to support a candidate or a cause or an issue, but it also means that there's a lot of freedom to innovate and to think about what works in your community and then share that with others. So that's my wish for all of you, and thank you for the honor of getting to talk to you today.
One very specific call to action on Tuesday, and it's specially set at 4 p.m. It'll reasonably be around 4 p.m. Alameda County's quite likely going to award Flock $2.4 million to renew their license plate readers, drones as first responder. They're going to add private camera networks, a whole lot more cameras, 1-year retention period, Flock Nova. There's all sorts of bad things in there. They have the worst contract I've ever reviewed in my life in 2023. And in big areas, including liability, they've actually made this proposed version even worse. You can participate in public comment by Zoom if you're not, able to drive up there. So I hope you might throw us some help up there in the East Bay. Speaking more broadly, a lot of the feedback we got in our breakout group, you're never going to learn all this stuff on your own or be able to find all this information. The EFF, ACLU, Fight for the Future, Secure Justice, we all have free open newsletters. Sign up. They're curated. We'll deliver the information to you. We'll let you know when there's state legislation that you care about is happening, when votes are coming up, when coalitions are getting built, and how to participate. Related to that, timing matters. Find the scandal. It might be identified in our newsletters from public records we've made, but submit public record requests in your own jurisdiction. That's where a lot of this information is coming from. That creates the opening. Politics is quite often like policing. It's reactive. They're going to respond to the media, the negative media, informed public showing up, making public comments saying, I have a problem when your audit logs show X, Y, and Z is being done with license plate readers. That creates that opportunity to have that conversation and to educate these folks. I can tell you from 1 million meetings I've been in, the lack of privacy literacy at all levels of government is alarming. It's not necessarily nefarious, they just don't know. It's why city attorneys are approving bad contracts. They don't even know what they're looking at. Help educate them, get them up to speed. Quite often that's been the missing link. It's not that we're necessarily ideologically opposed, it's that they didn't even know there was a problem. So I hope you get involved that way, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you all. So I'm going to put on two hats today. First of all, with respect to the legal issues breakout session that we had, I am so impressed by the level of knowledge increase that we saw at this session. We did another one of these sessions a couple of months ago, and people didn't even know what Flock meant. They didn't know what ALPR stood for. And now we're sitting in a room having detailed conversations about privacy. And thank you, Brian, for calling out that this is a two-sided issue. It is obviously the safety aspect is very important, public safety is very important, and privacy is very important. And we need both of those issues to be part of that dialogue. Now, putting on my local hat and call to action, there are three things I wanted to talk about. First of all, a follow-up to this event on July 19th. There is going to be an event called New Detention, New Surveillance. It's going to talk about the linkage between the detention center that is planned in Gilroy and surveillance technology. It's sponsored by our friends at Bay Resistance, July 19th, 3 p.m. at the Mountain View Community Center. Hope to see some of you there. Also, there is a national week of action against ALPRs. This movement has grown so much that we are having a nationwide week about different issues associated with ALPR. It's August 16 through 22. Check the DFLOC website for information. They're plotting all of the different cities throughout the nation who will be sponsoring events. Our organization will be sponsoring an event. We don't know yet what it will be, but keep your eye out for that. We still have, a couple of months. Then I wanted to talk about our coalition that we have formed, Safety Over Surveillance, SOS Palo Alto. We are starting in Palo Alto for two major reasons. Number one, our city council has shown leadership in the civil rights arena, and we think that it is a good place to start. And second, Palo Alto is the heart of Silicon Valley, and many of these technologies such as Palantir are still here, and some of them started here and have grown. So we think Palo Alto is the right place. We will be forming coalitions throughout Santa Clara County and San Mateo County. Please talk to us if you are interested in joining our coalition. Finally, with respect to the Palo Alto City Council, after break, we hope that we will have a discussion about the audit that the City Council has already authorized on the FLOC contract. We hope to see a full-fledged audit, and we hope to mobilize people to come out, talk about that audit, talk about the need to cancel our contract with FLOC. So with that, I will turn it back to David.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.